This is a case of a patient with a dislocated IOL who had elevation in their pressure, history of pseudoexfoliation, and fluctuating vision. The IOL is a three-piece IOL dislocated in the bag with some retained cortical material as well. Here you can see I'm preloading a 27 gauge needle with a section of 5-prolene. The section is cut at a bevel so that it threads easily into the 27 gauge needle. That needle is then placed 2 millimeters posterior to the limbus and through the capsular bag and underneath the haptic. This is facilitated by use of an intraocular forceps to guide the needle through the capsular bag. The needle is placed on the side with the greatest dislocation and is just a needle not on anything else so that an assistant can push the exposed end at the hub of the needle through the needle so that it enters into the anterior chamber and can be grasped by the intraocular forceps and externalized through a paracentesis. The needle is withdrawn and the 5-prolene is grasped at the sclera, and a second needle is placed anterior by about a ½ millimeter through conjunctiva and sclera and into the sulcus, this time passing in front of the dislocated haptic bag complex. This was externalized through the paracentesis with the assistance and guidance of that intraocular forceps, and then the other end of the same section of 5-prolene can be threaded into the 27 gauge needle. The needle is then externalized through sclera and conjunctiva, and the exposed end of the 5-prolene is grasped and treated with low temperature cautery to create a small ball or flange, and then that can be gradually tightened and adjusted so that there is good support of the haptic and bag in that area. Those small flanges are then placed through the conjunctiva into sclera. This time it became evident that the opposite side also had very poor zonular support, and there was a little bit of vitreous that was coming around into the anterior chamber, a little bit of posterior pressure from fluid that had passed behind the IOL, and so a 23 gauge trocar was placed. And since we only have small incisions at this point, that could be placed easily through conjunctiva and sclera in order to perform an anterior vitrectomy. A second 27 gauge needle is used to enter through conjunctiva and sclera 2 millimeters posterior to the limbus and 180 degrees from the previously placed 5-prolene belt loop. And again, this is guided underneath the haptic through the capsular bag with the use of an intraocular forceps. And then that's confirmed as far as placement by manipulating the iris so that good visualization is obtained. In this case, I did not pre-place the 5-prolene and instead used the intraocular forceps to pass the prolene into the 27 gauge needle. And so you can pre-place that prolene, you can externalize the tip of the needle, or you can place it into the 27 gauge needle intraocularly. And that was the second pass, 1 millimeter anterior to the first pass of the other end of the 5-prolene through the 27 gauge needle, externalized at the surface of the eye through conjunctiva and sclera, and then trimmed and treated with low temperature cautery in order to form a flange that can then be placed through conjunctiva flush with the sclera so that it supports each side of the lens at the haptics through capsular bag with a belt loop configuration of 5-prolene suture. That limited anterior vitrectomy is performed. The incisions were hydrated. Some myostat was placed in the anterior chamber. And even with the trocar system, I like to place a vicryl suture to close the sclerotomy. And this can be placed through conjunctiva and sclera. And if you pre-place the suture like this, you don't lose sight of where the sclerotomy is, and it's much easier to close reliably. At the end of the case, the implant is very well centered and supported. Thank you for your attention.